Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. I admire your stamina. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to speak. And I think it's been a very rich experience. It really has. And I've enjoyed it very, very much. It would confirm everything that Judith has just said if this was to be regarded as the last word. So I prefer to put it in the context of stammering and stuttering, as you were. So what I want to do at the start is just to, this is the Loyola Institute, and Ignatius of Loyola in his spiritual exercises had this habit of proposing compositions of place. So they were kind of scenes, usually, but not always, from the scriptures, to prepare the retreatant for prayer. And I want to offer you 3 compositions of place at the beginning, just to set the scene. The first is in the 1970s, and it's in Milltown Park, where the Milltown Institute used to operate. And Father Raymond Maloney, who is a systematic theologian, you could say, of impeccable orthodoxy, is giving a public lecture in the aula there. And in the course of it, he proposes that the church proceed with the ordination of women as deacons. And the reason he gave was not solely, but not least to reimagine those who grace our altars and to test the sense of faith of the faithful with respect to priestly ordination. So it was a kind of an exercise in reimagining the church. This proposal was regarded as too weak by many in the audience. If memory serves, that was before the CDF's Inter Insignores of 76, and of course certainly before John Paul's 1994 Ordinatio Sacerdotales. And here we are 50 years later in the successor of the Milltown Institute, and we're talking about this same issue. My second composition of place is a number of decades later, and it's taken from the 34th General Congregation of the Jesuits in Rome in 1995. So there was a gathering there of about 224 Jesuits from all over the world, and a proposal had been made not long after the January opening of the congregation to add to the pre-prepared agenda a discussion on the role of women in church and civil society. And because of the structures of the congregation, it needed a majority of votes even to proceed to discussion. So after a day or two of mulling over it, the vote was taken, and it got 114 in favour. So that's out of 224. So it was a narrow majority to at least proceed with discussion. There followed then weeks and months, because it went on through to late March, of arguing, discussing, lobbying, gossiping, and discernment. And often the differences that were among the assembled group focused on the suspicion that this was a Western agenda, and that enculturation demanded that the particular circumstances of other global regions, not least Africa, India, Eastern Europe, would be respected. So to counter that, we drew, and this was the start of emails and internet and so on, and we reached out to women from these regions that were talked about and elsewhere to enlighten the discussion. And particularly we were lucky to find Dr. Patricia Licuanan, who was a Filipino chair of the UN Committee on the Dignity of Women. And she fed back to us that women are globally oppressed, and that the rubric of enculturation is often used to stymie action on their behalf. At a second vote in February, the majority in favour had risen from 114 to 160. And then at the final vote, it was up to 190. That was in March. The experience and I'm mentioning this because it comes up in terms of the Irish synodal experience, and what Julianne was talking about last night, was one of discernment, which certainly had elements of spiritual conversation, but also integrated discussion, debate, and theological reflection. These were all components of the discernment. The content of the resultant decree, Decree 14, focused on listening to the voices of women, which is a core synodal principle, but we didn't talk about synodality at that stage. The third composition of place is the one that Phyllis referred to in her talk. It's Pope Francis in 2016 on the 12th of May, meeting with a large group of women religious in the Paul VI audience hall in the Vatican. And the meeting, as Phyllis described, was by way of question and answer, pre-prepared. One of the early questions, I think was the first one, was about the role of women in the church, particularly in decision-making processes, and it verged on the issues around ordination. And you can sense from the recorded transcript, and I remember talking to one sister who was at the particular event, that the Pope was at home with the audience. He likes joshing with women religious, and they were pushing him as well, which was great. But he was at home, and he answered along the lines that are very familiar and have come up here over the last 24 hours. The need to open up more decision-making roles in the church to the non-ordained, the complementarity of men and women, the particular difficulty associated with the Eucharist, where the presider must be in persona Christi. And it's almost at this point, I'm imagining it, so I'm taking license here with the text that's up on the Vatican website, that the Pope at this point hears the echo of his own voice and is aware that what he's saying is not so self-evident. I think he's a very gifted communicator, and he usually nails it. And maybe he got a bit of an echo as he was saying these things. And he says then, but it is, I quote, "It is possible to study and explain further what I have just said very quickly and rather simply." Now, again, Phyllis may know more about this. My memory is at the time, and I remember regretting afterwards I didn't take it down, I looked at the Vatican account of it at the time, and it said something like that the Pope noted that it was a complicated theological argument. He couldn't develop it now, but he'll be back next year to do it. And if that's true, what's there at the moment on the Vatican website is a very sanitized version, and these things happen in media circles, you know. But towards the end, anyway, having criticized clericalism, he comes back to the topic, and I quote, "I will ask, and perhaps I will get this to the President, the Congregation for Divine Worship, to explain properly and in depth what I have said rather briefly on preaching in the Eucharistic celebration, as I don't have sufficient theology or clarity to explain it now. But we must distinguish clearly. Preaching at a liturgy of the Word is one thing, and this can be done. But the Eucharistic celebration is something else. Here there's a different mystery. It is the mystery of Christ's presence, and the priest or bishop celebrates in persona Christi." End of quote. Now, as we know, Pope Francis did try to explain this further in an interview with America, which again has been referenced more than once over the last 24 hours. And he did so in terms of the Petrine and Marian theological principles in the church, which he didn't explicitly attribute to von Balthasar, but which are clearly from von Balthasar's theology. And Margie gave us a bar on that, and Judith has referred in another context to Tina Beattie, and she did a savage critique of von Balthasar's theology in general, and this aspect in particular. I'm inclined to side with Bernard on this. I do think that there may be an intuition there that has some wisdom in it, but that it's overextended and it's used in a way that's essentialist and ontological, that breaches its symbolic meaning in whatever way one understands that. What emerges to me from that third composition of place is an uncomfortable feeling that current church teaching on this issue is not easily explained or perhaps even explicable. And that the theology is sometimes used as a mystifying rather than a clarifying argument. So it recalls for me, the Irish people here will appreciate it, the Father Ted pro-sitcom satire. When things get a bit difficult for Ted and so on, he'd say, well, that would be an ecumenical matter. And that's the way that you kind of kick things into the long grass. And I think there's a bit of that about it. What also emerges, though, I think, from this meeting is, and this has been mentioned a number of times in different kinds of ways, the value of encounter. So you're with a group and you take them seriously and you're in good faith. And of course you have all kinds of unconscious bias and well, one of the ways is, as you know, Bernard, in terms of being a psychologist, one of the ways one tackles bias is through talking, through therapy. And that's the great release, it seems to me, with this synodal method. We're being encouraged to talk. And that's a great way to change a culture. And it seems to me that Pope Francis, being at home with the group, takes their concerns seriously. I suspect is conscious of the limitations of his own approach and wants to do better. Encounters, I think, do lead to conversion, and as Phyllis set out, he did give a positive answer to the idea of a commission on the diaconate, even if it doesn't seem to have got very far. So with these three images as background, and my intention is to operate now, as I go into the theological argument, out of a rather traditional and conventional Catholic ecclesial self-understanding. So what I would like to show is that by joining up the dots of some already agreed positions, we can come to some surprising conclusions. So the first thing is synodality. From the beginning, particularly in his 2015 50th anniversary address, but also in his early interview given to the Jesuit magazines, Francis has linked synodality with the sense of faith of the faithful. And he harks back very explicitly to the association of that with infallibility in Lumen Gentium 12. And to the share of the baptized, that was brought up last night, just this notion of baptism, the share of the baptized in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly offices of Jesus Christ. In other words, holiness, teaching, and governance. Francis has always made clear that this synodal way of being is rooted in an encounter with Jesus Christ in faith, either directly in prayer or through the multiple presences of Christ in others, in events, in nature, in history, in the cosmos. And that also it ought to lead to a missionary outreach, not in terms of proselytism, making conversions, but rather in terms of bringing hope and light to our wounded and broken world. Just to say that very quickly, that's, to me, one of the main motives for considering seriously the topic we're considering, both for the sake of men and women themselves, for the whole human race, but also for the credibility of the Church's mission. I think when somebody mentioned about young people, of course they're busy during the week and they're exhausted, but why would they come to a church which takes up positions on sexuality and gender that are so out of kilter with what their own contemporaries believe and feel, and which are unsupported by serious theological argument, it seems to me. So it is a missionary thing as well as a question of justice. So to this end, he encouraged free speech, that famous parousia, and a patient and generous listening, not least to those with whom we disagree. So he's proposed that in the image of the Trinity, so synodality, unity and diversity, it comes from that depth, if you like. The diversity that ensues or that is made evident, it already exists, we'll find its unity in Jesus Christ and this will occur through a discernment carried out with the help of the Holy Spirit. So that shifts discernment. Often we, certainly Jesuits, I think the Dominicans have a more communal understanding of it, but we've often used it in a more personal, individualistic kind of way. But I suppose since the 60s we have moved out to a more communal sense, going back to Ignatius himself with one example of communal discernment. So it is not just personal, it's communal, and it's ecclesial. He's extending this to the whole church. And I think the significance of it is, and this is core, that it's a reminder that the church has confidence in its own ability to discern the signs of the times and not to become captive to the zeitgeist, to the spirit of the age. They may coincide in places, but they will also diverge. And so there's some capacity to distinguish between the two. All this is summed up well by Raphael Luciani. He's, as you know, the Venezuelan theologian operating out of Boston, and he talks about the church in Latin America. And he says, the synodal spirit manifested at Medellin in 1968 presupposed a model of church as people of God that gave primacy to the sensus fidei and the sensus fidelium, Lumen Gentium 12. Thus, he says, the infallibility in credendo, in believing, of the whole people of God, experienced in a concrete historical reality, was the context within which the pastor's infallibility in docendo, in teaching, was exercised. So you can't have good teaching without good listening to the experience of faith of the believers. And like in Acts 15, the original synodal composition of place, if you like, all that is to be tested, Jesse explained that well last night, by the fruits of the discernment. Technically, in theological terms, the reception that the teaching gets. And you remember the joy in Antioch. But we know that through church history, church teaching hasn't always been received with joy. There has been resistance, and it's often required repeated attempts at clarification in order to achieve the peace that is the fruit of good discernment. And I want to talk about whether it's more than just clarification. So it seems to me the Irish-American sociologist of religion, Michelle Dillon, she's done a very fine book on post-secularism and synodality. She has it right in terms of what this process involves, and she's very erudite and she uses very erudite terms, but she puts it very simply, inelegantly at one stage, but nails it. She says, once you take synodality seriously, the cat is out of the bag. So basically, once you allow everybody to have a voice and you regard the sensus fidei as intrinsic to the formation and reception of church teaching, then you have to take that seriously. And so you may not get it right the first time, but if there's discontent, if it's not received properly, you have to go back to it. And you have to look again. And it may need a third time and a fourth time and so on. And I think she's right. So once this becomes an essential part of the formation and reception of church teaching, then orthodoxy has to take account not just of fidelity to the text of previous teaching, but also to the living congruence between this teaching and the faith experience of believers in a changing world. So you can't just quote old teaching as if that gave all the answers. I'm obviously referring, there is a distinction between, if you like, central dogmatically defined definitions, but most of the stuff here we're talking about is not of that nature. And as I say, if we don't get it right the first time. So that's the sensus fidei. Then church teaching. There's some discussion about the relationship between synodality and church teaching, sparked off not least by the book, which I think is a fine book, Let Us Dream, co-authored with Austin Ivory, where there's a short passage there which seems to have Pope Francis rule out the idea that synods are in any way about church teaching. Now, I think that's overstretching what he actually says. I've spoken to Austin about this himself, and he admits he didn't come back and question the Pope any further. I think history will show us that synods have been part of the process of church teaching. And the Pope himself, in the Motu Proprio Spiritus Domini in 2021, and the accompanying documentation, that was the Motu Proprio, where he introduced lay ministries of acolyte and lector, male and female, and he made that clear that this was what he called a doctrinal development aid by synodal conversations. So he's already on record himself of allowing exceptions to what seemed like an absolute prohibition of any tie between synodality and church teaching. And there's a document then which makes it very clear that it's Orthodox Catholic teaching that there is a tie between synodality and church teaching. So just before Bernard Pottier came on the International Theological Commission, they published a document in 2014 on the sense of faith in the life of the church. It was signed off by the then prefect of the then CDF, it's now not known as the CDF, Cardinal Gerhard Müller. So this study clearly connects church teaching with the sense of faith of the faithful, and clearly connects that sense of faith of the faithful with inter alia synods. It also proposes, and this is important, a clear protocol with regard to instances where there's a clash between current church teaching and the sense of faith of the faithful. Number 8, he talks about where there is difficulty or resistance or indifference. They're all different. Difficulty, resistance, indifference. I would say, for example, with regard to Humanae Vitae, for a lot of Catholics at this stage, it's indifference. The difficulty was an earlier phase, and resistance. And they go on to say then, where there is difficulty or resistance or indifference, such cases may be due to weakness or lack of faith on the part of the people of God. So it might be people are lax. But in some cases, quote, it may indicate that certain decisions have been taken by those in authority without due consideration of the experience of the sensus fidei of the faithful, or without sufficient consultation of the faithful by the magisterium. Number 1, 2, 3. And then they have a protocol, if you like, of how to handle situations like that. If that is the case, if it's not due to the laziness or the, I don't know what you'd say, the spiritual infidelity of people, but is due to a lack of connection between the teaching and the lived experience of people, in such cases, the magisterium should reflect on the teaching, quote, that has been given and consider whether it needs clarification. That's the one favoured by the Irish bishops. They did a survey before the synodal process about the faith in Ireland and so on. It was for the World Meeting of Families, and it got a very negative feedback about church teaching on sexuality, and what they registered it to their, you know, to be fair to them, they did register that and said it out straight, but the remedy then was we need to clarify it further. So that's one of the things that this document said. It needs clarification or reformulation. Reformulation is interesting because it could mean just nicer ways of saying the same thing, or it could be something a little more radical. And the fact that it could be a little more radical is confirmed later in the document, in number 84, where it says, with the help of theology and with regard to non-dogmatic teaching, we should be looking at in which areas a revision of previous positions is needed. A revision of previous positions is needed. That's pretty significant, it seems to me, in Vatican speak. And all of that, incidentally, applies not just to matters of faith, but also to moral teaching. So it's clear from this study as well that synods are one well-approved traditional way of identifying the sense of faith of the faithful. I'm going to go quickly through the next bit because I'm sensed that how are we doing for time? We've 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Just to say that some of this kind of theology has been done by a surprising theologian called Joseph Ratzinger, in the sense before he became Pope, and he talked with approval of 4 particular decrees in Vatican II, which he called the counter syllabus, and it was in reference to the syllabus of errors in the 19th century, and he said that needed correction. And the sort of phrase he used was that in such instances, principles remain the same, but concrete historical situations and their demands lead to a certain necessary discontinuity. Now, discontinuity is not a word you associate with Joseph Ratzinger, but he uses it here. So, and the philosopher I was formed in mostly was Bernard Lonergan, a Canadian philosopher. He talked a lot about the self-corrective process of learning. He also talked a lot about the shift from classical to historical consciousness. So, and he talked a lot, which goes back to what we were talking about this morning in terms of bias, that in history there are vectors or factors of progress and factors of decline. And among the factors of decline are bias. And they can be personal bias, it can be social or communal bias, or it can be the bias of common sense. And he's very interesting on the bias of common sense. And a lot of these biases can be unconscious, of course. The bias of common sense is one where we have habitual ways of looking at the world and of doing things which serve us very well as long as the questions remain the same. But when the question changes, we need some new theory and a new common sense. And he says in that interim period, common sense is actually nonsense. It doesn't do the job. So what's happening, I think, in our church at the moment is that with regard to certain well-known contested and so-called hot-button issues around sexuality and gender, there is that kind of period where it's not being received by the sense of the faithful, and that wasn't so important as long as the church didn't value the sense of faith of the faithful. But clearly now it does. It's named it. It does value it, and it does value it in its role in synods. And so the document that Julianne referred to last night, the document for the Continental Synod, the DCS, in number 8 makes it very clear that what it's presenting is not just a sociological survey of Catholic opinion at any particular time, but it's a privileged instance of the sense of faith of the faithful. That's what they describe it as. And it was in that kind of knowledge that the Irish contribution at Prague that Julianne and Eamon Fitzgibbon presented referred to the work of the Holy Spirit in renewing and inspiring, I quote, any necessary doctrinal, structural, canonical and pastoral changes without destroying communion or losing sight of the person and teaching of Jesus Christ. So they explicitly call for any necessary doctrinal changes. So it seems to me it's within that context then of synodality and the sensus fidei fidelium that I want to consider the issue of ministry within the Catholic Church, and particularly the role of women, and I will be concluding with this. It is, as has been pointed out several times, highlighted in that DCS document. There's the call for women to participate fully in the life of the Church, and it's reported that a growing awareness and sensitivity towards this issue is registered all over the world, number 60. The form that this awareness takes around ministry, it's already been said, is agreement with the Pope that women should share in decision-making, decision-taking, a favourable openness towards the diaconate and women, and a more divided, if still somewhat open stance towards priestly ordained ministry. So let me go quickly on to the ministry bit. So I'm not an expert in this area in terms of ministry. I don't want to focus so much on its distinctions from charism or its historical grounding, but rather what joining up the dots that I've mentioned so far can point us to with regard to ordained ministry. I've argued that synodality is connected with church teaching through the sensus fidei fidelium. I want to make the argument now that this sense of the faithful as evidence within the synodal process shows that the questions around the ordination of women should now become open questions, not closed questions, and they're certainly due for a theological review. So, as I said, it's clear that the church is open at the moment to a greater decision-making role for women. And we're being encouraged to take the route that Pope Francis has also opened up in Spiritus Domini and in Antiquum Ministerium, whereby he's instituted the ministries of lector, acolyte, and then catechist for both laymen and women, or for both men and women. It remains to be seen to what extent local churches take up this lead. I know we're slow in Ireland to do it. Tom O'Loughlin, the Irish liturgist and historian, argues that it would be a good way of actually and visibly creating a liturgically more synodal church. So to have a visible representation, if you're talking about iconic and in persona Christi, to have men and women dressed up liturgically in some kind of a way helps the imagination to get used to the fact that it is not one single male, or as in those Vatican concelebrations, which are gorgeously orchestrated. But if you begin to notice at all that this is all men, you say to yourself, what is going on here? So Tom is arguing, and I think this is a practical way, one practical way of doing away with clericalism. There's clearly quite an openness towards the female diaconate. A number of people say subject to the approval of the universal church and papal. There's obviously a more questioning openness to female priesthood. And it may well be, Phyllis and myself probably disagree on this a little, but we're allowed that, aren't we? Disagreements. I suspect that the openness to the female diaconate is partly due to the fact that the Pope has signalled that already and people have that reflex, and partly due to what Ray Maloney was arguing back in the 1970s, that it's a way of testing the waters, but that people really are aiming for the priesthood as well. But who knows? So the scholarly work, thanks to you two and others more greatly in your debt, has been carried out with regard to diaconate in particular. And I think that's enormously helpful. And particularly in our Catholic Church, I think our church has a bit of a fetish around doctrinal development, and it always likes to see it in continuity with what's gone on before. And whether that's right or not is the reality. And so if you can establish something that's happened before, you're already halfway there. It's so important. And that was one of the principles, as you know, in the Second Vatican Council, ressourcement. And it was that return to the sources was what drove the Nouvelle Theology in France. So go back beyond scholasticism, back particularly to the area of the fathers. We weren't looking at the mothers at the time, and the scriptures. However, it might be interesting to consider whether historical precedent, while definitely helpful, is always a necessary precondition for doctrinal change. Remember that aggiornamento was another principle of Vatican II, so a reading of the signs of the times and changes that might take place accordingly. And it was a hermeneutical principle. It seemed to me from all the ecclesiology, I'm not a specialist ecclesiologist, when I was a theologian I was doing Trinity and Christology and so on, but it seems to me from what I've read of ecclesiologists that it's clear that Jesus himself laid down fairly minimal requirements for the shape of the church. And is it anachronistic to expect answers from Jesus for all the questions that arise now? Tom O'Loughlin has it in his pithy kind of way. He says, it's a bit like asking, did horse-drawn carriages 200 years ago obey the speed limits? So it's a different sort of question here. And it seems that ministry in the church and ordained ministry, priestly ministry in particular, was a historical development not directly traceable back to Jesus himself. And I think we might do well to avoid the notion that there was once, even with Jesus Christ, a golden age when everything was clear and to which we need to return now. But rather consider that perhaps, the word incarnation has been used a lot, perhaps incarnationally things were always a little muddled, and that the greatest help Jesus offers is through the gift of the Spirit, which is there to help us discern the muddle, the signs of the times. So precedent, I think, is important, historical precedent, and it's very useful at the moment. But I think it functions in a negative way rather than the positive way in terms of the priesthood of women. If you could show that Jesus definitely said that women shouldn't be ordained priests, then you're in trouble with regard to trying to argue for the priesthood. However, if that's not so, then it's a different question. Now, it would seem that the church, particularly in 1994, whatever about 1976, the 1994 document is very clear that it's not so much the argument from the icon or from complementarity or the Petrine, Marian, whatever variation you give it. It's rather that the church doesn't consider that it has the authority to ordain women as priests. And Chris O'Donnell, a Carmelite deceased, who's a very balanced kind of man, in his Encyclopedia of the Church looks at this and he says, it's not even a scriptural thing so much as an argument from tradition. But again, if you think about it, it would be odd to have an argument from tradition that it didn't have some basis in scripture. And that Pontifical Biblical Commission that did meet in the 1970s and had Raymond Brown and Carlo Martini on it, and whose findings weren't ever definitively published. It was a bit like one of these, your commission on the diaconate, but it was leaked. And they make it very clear that by large majorities, they discovered that this was not solved one way or the other in Scripture, and that you could not argue from Scripture alone that women priests were incompatible with the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's always puzzled me that the church has been so strong on saying it doesn't have the authority. Okay, I'm finishing. I just want to suggest one further thing with regard to that seems to me important, that it is clear that in the dispute in the early church around the Gentiles and the admission of the Gentiles into communion, that what was of crucial importance was the experience of the church in Antioch, where it was clear that even if they weren't circumcised, they were filled with the Spirit. And so the people at the Council of Jerusalem were able to share that and say, look, whatever about the theology of it, and there were contrasting theological positions, this is the experience. It seems to me that maybe what we're lacking at the moment in terms of this particular issue, and I'm talking about ordination to the priesthood, there are women who have suffered and have had painful experiences of having felt called and having tried to articulate that, and they've been told basically to go away. And it's been very, very hurtful. Maybe a space has opened up now with this synodal conversation where the encouragement is to speak with candour. If those women can take the brave step of coming forward, that's what we're missing at the moment. And certainly in the Irish church, we're missing the witness of women who feel called to ordained ministry. It's all right for the rest of us to argue for it and to do so for different reasons, justice reasons or whatever, men and women, the needs of the church for greater variety in ministry, parishes closing and so on and so forth. But it would help, I think, if a cohort of women could speak in that kind of way. That would help us, I think, to truly test the spirits and not to stifle the spirit. Okay, I finish. It's one thing to join up the dots in what I've tried to do in a fairly logical way, I hope. It's another to confront the maelstrom of different reactions to the concrete historical situation of the contemporary church. So you have to kind of take prudential decisions. But I hate the phrase managing expectations. I really do. I can imagine them running to the tomb and saying, so don't run, manage expectations. He's dead, he's dead, he's dead. We're a church who has good news. The most surprising things can happen. So, okay, there's room for prudence and there's room for discernment and decisions and so on. But it should start from that big sense that everything is possible. And so, I think the facilitations, I think that's one of the great things about synodality, that it does give us this space for the facilitation of difficult conversations which embrace the kind of conflict that Judith so elegantly spoke of. And my final thing is to say that I'm very glad that the Loyola Institute is hosting a conference like this, because it seems to me, unlike the German situation, unlike the Australian situation, unlike the Latin American situation, we in Ireland and in other European churches have been slow to call on the theological community to engage in the synodal process. So we prided ourselves rather on a method of spiritual conversation which listens to people's heartfelt feelings, but which up to now has eschewed, has put to one side deeper engagement with the human, the physical, the social sciences, and with theology and philosophy. So the fact that this symposium is here and there is this wealth of theological wisdom, I would like to think that the next step in Ireland, when we're looking at the particular Irish situation, would involve some kind of integration of this methodology of spiritual conversation and discernment with an engagement with the intellectual community, and particularly the theological community. Thank you very much.